Oh my God. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. When I go through your brief biographies, feel free to interrupt me if I've got anything wrong, okay? Mm-hmm. So, Harry, you are known...
Can I interrupt you now? Because I just hate hearing my biography. It makes me cringe internally.
Oh, that gives me such pleasure. I'm going to take this slowly. Harry Sadler. He writes both fiction and non-fiction, focusing on relationships, ecology...
I really need to update that because I don't write fiction anymore.
Harry Sadler wrote both fiction and writes non-fiction, focusing on relationships, ecology, and the philosophical nature of human interactions with other animals. You may know him as the author of The Eastern Curlew, which is a fantastic book, and a book that needed to be written, so thank you. You also write for... Oh, that book was shortlisted for the Queensland Literary Awards, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Yeah. You also publish in Meanjin and The Guardian, and your most recent book is Questions Raised by Quolls, about which more later. Chris, do you cringe when your biography is written?
No, I love it.
So we'll just hurry through this then. Chris is the author of 3 novels, the first of which, A Tiger in Eden, was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Book Prize. Not too shabby.
I suppose so, if you say so.
I do say so. You also write for the Paris Review, the Griffith Review, the Age, the Australian, the Meanjin. Your most recent novel is Mammoth, also about which more later, about whatever that sentence should say. But your most recent book is a collection of eye-popping short stories called Here Be Leviathans, and you talked about that eloquently yesterday, so we won't be focusing on that today. Both of you write really beautifully and eloquently and movingly about extinctions and why the loss of a single species chips away at all our individual humanities, and we will talk about that. But, Harry, I want you to imagine that I'm a publisher. You've come into my office. I've already told you, no, you cannot use my toilet. You can use the one down the hall. I have the attention span of a golden retriever. And I want you to sell me your book about quolls. Go. So far it's not going very well, Harry. I'm losing interest rapidly.
So
there's a queue of people out there.
One reason why I write books instead of writing articles is because I'm absolutely terrible at pitching things. So when I pitched the Quolls book to my publisher, I had to write like sort of a 2,000-word sample chapter for them to understand what the hell I was going on about, and then they were convinced. So I can probably pull that up on my phone if you want me to read that.
Harry, that's backstory. Just give me the pitch.
So it's broadly speaking, it's about the fact that Australia has the worst mammal extinction and endangerment record in the world. That's all happened very quickly since European colonisation. So there's no ifs and buts about why that's happened. It's very clearly happened in the last 200 years as a direct result of habitat destruction and introduced predators and the like. So that's the overview. Let's look at conservation, and of course conservation. The main aim of conservation, or animal conservation, is you want the animals to breed. You want them to start having baby animals and build up the population. So that seemed to me a logical way of tying in the question that a lot of people my age and younger are having at the moment about what are the ethics of having children and raising children in a world of environmental crisis and increasing and accelerating environmental crisis. So for me, it made sense it's basically about animals wanting to have kids in various contexts, and it made sense to me.
Okay.
It's a sex book.
Okay, Chris, same publisher. I've just had this clown come in and try and sell me a book about quolls. Now, I'm sure you have got something much more sensible to offer. Sell me Mammoth.
Right. So you know that clown who was in here before talking about extinction. Mine is in that vein, except the twist is the extinct animals are coming back.
Okay.
And so we will be looking at a number of specimens that currently are real and exist, dead animals, and how we are able to, how they wind up in museums and in private collections around the world, and how we are going to use synthetic biology to take DNA samples from them where possible in order to revive those creatures and repopulate the planet in order to save the environment that he's destroying.
Chris, I feel like there's something you're holding out on me here about this book.
Oh, it's the book is told in the voices of the actual animals that we are bringing back. So they're telling the story themselves.
So the bones are actually speaking.
Yes, they are. That's correct.
That should have been what you led with.
You're a big fan of speaking bones here at this publishing house, yeah?
Okay, Harry, what was your first experience or first exposure to a quoll? First of all, what is a quoll?
So a quoll is a carnivorous marsupial, a native Australian species. There are 4 species in Australia and 2 in New Guinea. You've probably seen pictures of them. They're sort of usually orangey brown, sometimes black, and they've got big white spots all over them. So they're very charismatic. They're related to Tasmanian devils, related also to Dunarts, Antechinus. Basically all the carnivorous marsupials are all dasyurids of one kind or another. The spotted-tailed quoll, which is the only one that... Oh, sorry, spotted-tailed quoll is the only one of the sort of southeastern species, of which there's also the eastern quoll. The eastern quoll went extinct on the mainland. The spotted-tailed quoll still survived, but in a very fragmented way. And the spotted-tailed quoll is the second largest surviving marsupial carnivore after the Tasmanian devil. Obviously, the largest was the thylacine, but that's extinct.
Yeah.
Not for long.
Not for long.
But what was your first experience of a quoll?
The first ever experience was my dad had a big glossy coffee table book of all the Australian mammals, and there was this photo right at the front of a western quoll, I think it was, eating a rosella. And I sort of never realised, I mean, I was just a kid when I saw this, I never really realised that Australia had carnivorous marsupials. You know, we think of kangaroos and wombats and koalas and things, you know, they eat leaves. But of course, a functioning ecosystem has animals that eat the animals that eat the leaves as well, and it just had never kind of occurred to me. And so it was kind of exciting to see that. And then I saw them a couple of times camping with my dad in Tasmania. One time we were camping in the walls of Jerusalem National Park, and a whole sort of raiding party of eastern quolls came bounding out of the bush to kind of rummage around among our pots and pans after we'd finished cooking dinner. Another time, somewhat infamously in my family, we were walking along the South Coast track, southwest Tasmania, and on the first night of camping, we were walking with a friend of my dad's named Jeff, and he'd baked this amazing fruit cake that he was carrying, and we were going to eat it for our afternoon tea on the whole sort of 7-day walk. And we had it for dessert after having our dinner on the first night of camping. So we'd had enough of a taste to know how tasty it was and look forward to it. And then from out of the sand dunes, from out of the tea tree heath, a big spotted-tailed quoll came out and grabbed the rest of the cake and just made off with it into the tea tree. So we still sort of, in our memory, kind of shake our fist at that quoll. But it was at the same time, incredibly exciting to see this very charismatic, large marsupial carnivore.
I had a very early experience with the quoll, but it might be a bit triggering for you because it doesn't end happily. But I was 8 years old and in Rockhampton, and as a family we'd gone to the drive-in to see 300 Spartans. And the sleep out had louver windows down one side, and the louvers were left open, and we had this canary that was on a table in a cage. And when we came home, the canary was stripped of its feathers. It was just sitting in a corner shivering, and all of its feathers were at the bottom of the cage. So clearly something had happened. And I mean, it hadn't undressed. So my father looked around the house, And he found under the radiogram, which is what we had in those days, this small creature, which he called a native cat.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm ashamed to say it, but he killed it. But I guess he thought, look, it's taken out the canary, the family's next.
So, historically, you can go back and look at historical records and books and things that people have written about from the early years of colonisation, and eastern quolls, which are the native cats in particular, are described as one of the most numerous species in the bush.
Yeah.
Once colonisation began and people were starting to live in sort of settlements, European colonisers were starting to live in settlements, they encountered this problem where the quolls kept on killing their chickens, basically. So that led to the persecution of quolls, and that and various other factors rapidly led to their sort of, vanishing. So, yeah, they are quite well known and notorious for going after birds. There's also been some studies that have concluded that the first attempts to introduce rabbits to Australia were actually thwarted because there were so many quolls, and the quolls ate them all, and it wasn't until quolls had been effectively eradicated that rabbits were able to take hold.
So what species of quoll would that one have been in?
So that would have been in southeastern Australia. So the two species that you get sort of in the coastal regions of southeastern Australia, where most people live then as now, were the eastern quoll and the spotted-tailed quoll.
Right. Well, anyway, the canary recovered, the quoll, not so much. Chris, I love mammoth, right? Mammoth, it's hilarious, but it's so much more than that. And there's this beautiful sentence in it. You have your mammoth say, "Every one of us that fell was a disaster, a repository of wisdom and ancestral memory stretching back tens of thousands of your so-called years." What I love about that is that when you're talking about extinctions, you're not talking broadly, you're bringing it down to individual lives and what happens when a single individual gets taken out. Can you talk to that?
Right, and that's because the way that I came into this book was through individual creatures. So the book is set the night before a real-life natural history auction in New York in 2007. They used to have them every year. They probably still do. They're probably resumed now. And anyone could go into the auction house and you could peruse what was on sale. And it would be like a wide variety of ephemera. There'd be animal fossils, there'd be sharks' teeth, there'd be meteorites, all sorts of odd things. And you could bid on them, and you could walk away with a shark's tooth or a strange rock, or if you were lucky, had enough money, something a bit larger. And traditionally, museums and so on would bid for these pieces for their collections. But in recent years, that had changed, and massive bids were coming in, often by phone or on the internet. Mystery buyers usually offering huge amounts of money for these fossils. And at this one in 2007, there was a mammoth sort of skull and tusks for sale. And there was the head of a Tyrannosaurus batar, which is the Mongolian cousin to T-Rex. There were dire wolves. There was the severed hand of an Egyptian mummy. All sorts of odd things. And the bidding on the Tyrannosaur skull was two mystery buyers on the internet, and it ended up selling for $276,000 to a private collector. That turned out to be the Hollywood actor Nicolas Cage, who outbid Leonardo DiCaprio, who was the other bidder. And what's been happening is museums are no longer able to acquire these very individual creatures because they're being bought by celebrities, essentially to put up on their wall. For a variety of, sometimes nefarious reasons, whether they want to show off to their friends. I don't know if Nicolas Cage is going to claim that he shot this Tyrannosaur and somehow, bagged it himself. So I became fascinated with who were these individual creatures and how did they wind up there? And it became quite an interesting study once I dug into it, because the mammoths in particular, there used to be literally millions of them that would roam the north of the earth. There used to be a great sort of steppe around the north of the world, and these great herds of mammoth and bison would just walk the earth, their whole life. It would take decades for them to get just to encircle the earth. But they were essentially operating the earth's refrigerator. This is before we turned up. So it was very cold and very dry. And they would stomp down the snow, and it just kept the ground really cold and hard. So essentially operating the earth's refrigerator. But then we turned up and killed them all. Literally slaughtered all of them. And that's roughly when things started to heat up again, because they weren't able to do their jobs anymore. And the huge irony about this is that recently, with the Siberian permafrost starting to melt, they are finding these individual mammoths locked in the permafrost. They're actually thawing out. And you can see great footage online of some of the guys out there exploring and finding the carcasses of mammoth, of woolly rhinoceros, all sorts of other megafauna that were perfectly preserved in the ice. They're thawing out. They still have fur. They still have flesh. They still have blood. And you can see them taking blood samples from this individual mammoth. And in fact, on the footage, if you watch it, you'll see there's a guy there, and he instantly just takes out his knife and slices off a piece of the mammoth flesh, pops it in his mouth and eats it, because he wants to be the first person in 10,000 years to say that he's eaten mammoth. Now, he probably should have checked to see if there's any parasites or anything else in there.
No, let's hope that he caught everything it was possible to catch.
Right. But now, so what's happening is, because we're able to collect blood samples and we have viable DNA from these creatures, synthetic biology teams all around the world. There's 3 primary teams, one in Harvard, run by Dr. George Church, who read my book and wrote a lovely praise quote on the back. He is working on bringing the mammoth back to life by tweaking the DNA of African elephants to make them hairy and have longer tusks and better able to survive in cold weather. There are 2 other teams, one in Korea and one in Shenzhen, China. And they are going hell for leather, bringing back all sorts of species, whether we like it or not, whether we think it's a good idea or not. But it's because they have the scary thing about it is they're collecting the DNA from a very specific mammoth that we, probably one of our predecessors, killed, speared. We're going to bring that specific animal back to life. We're not breeding new creatures. We're bringing those specific ones back. We're going to clone them back to life. They're going to be raised in the lab initially by African elephants until there's enough of them to breed naturally. This is actually happening. And you've probably seen in the news about the thylacine, and there's different groups trying to raise funding to bring the thylacine back. They're not breeding new ones. They're bringing back ones that we actually killed, like ones that are dead and in the ground. So there's this resurrection going on, which has never really happened before in our history, and it's quite a worrying trend because, typical humans, we're meddling with nature, playing God. We don't really know what we're doing. We don't really know where this is going to go. We don't really know if it's a good idea or not. But it's happening. It's outside of our hands. And if you watch the documentary, you'll see that some scientists go to the facility in China, and the guy says, how do you feel about the ethics of this? And the guide who's showing them around, she just gives him a big greasy and goes, oh, we don't care about your ethics. We're doing it. And that's the end of it. And right now, if you have $100,000 lying around, you can go to the lab in South Korea and have your dog or your cat or your budgie cloned. And in fact, it's been happening for years. Barbara Streisand, she has 2 little Coton de Tuileries puppies. They were not born naturally. They are part of a clone litter of her dog, Lady Violet, who died in 2017. Those are clones of Lady Violet. They can give you a clone litter, and
wow. Well, the upside of that is that they're not cloning Barbara Streisand.
We don't. But well, aren't they? Because
Oh my God.
if Barbara Streisand can afford 100 grand to get her puppies cloned, what's to stop her from saying, well, take some of mine and make one of me? It's not like, I mean, we all think human cloning is a dreadful idea, but it's not like you or I are going to get cloned. It's going to be the worst people in the world who get cloned.
Yeah.
We're going to get President Trump, version 2 in 2076. Well, he will run again, the new younger Trump,
Harry, along a similar lines, you argue really passionately in your book that human prosperity runs absolutely parallel to the impoverishing of the natural world.
Right.
And just a couple of days ago, just serendipitously in The Guardian, there was an article on livestock farming. And it pointed out that since 1970, 68% of animals have been wiped from the face of the earth, 68%. And in terms of biomass, 96% of terrestrial mammals are humans or farm animals, and only 4% is wildlife, which is just an absolutely astonishing figure. Now, do you think that the ghastly evolutionary accident of self-consciousness for our species is actually going to condemn us ultimately to extinction?
How long does this session go for again? Oh God.
Are we doomed, Harry?
So, when I was writing Quolls, as I said, one of the fundamental questions I wanted to address, or at least write around when I was writing it, was whether it's okay to have kids, and from the very start, I wanted to argue that or to examine that from the position of what the world would be like in 50, 60, 70 years' time, what kind of world the kids of today are going to grow up into. And when I've talked about the book since publication, and perhaps I wasn't clear enough in the book, but I've very strongly resist the idea or the argument that it's bad to have kids because overpopulation is a terrible thing and overpopulation is what's destroying the world. The reason I have a problem with that argument is that it seems to me that people who argue the overpopulation line are assuming that the economic systems, the cultural systems that we have in place now of capitalism and rampant exploitation and waste is going to continue and is sort of immutable and unchangeable. I feel like those are the systems that have created the ecological disasters that we have now, and if we can't imagine a world with different, more sustainable systems, which have existed in the past, the world is full of human civilization is full of examples of cultures and societies, including indigenous societies here in Australia that have lived sustainably. If we can't imagine a future with a more sustainable economic and social structure, then we may as well just all lie down in the grass and die, to be honest.
Do you think, because when you talk about your first encounters with quolls, there is a sense of wonder in the way you talk about it. Do you think that we people are losing the capacity to feel wonder when they look out around them at the natural world?
I don't think we're losing the capacity to feel wonder. I think it's just that the opportunities to experience that wonder are ever diminishing. There's the well-known phenomenon of shifting baseline syndrome, where unless we've seen, in our own lives that there used to be, when I was a kid, animals everywhere, and now there are animals nowhere. Unless we've actually seen that baseline shift, we just assume that what we see now is how it's always been. So there's so an example that's often given is that if you look back at photos from fishing competitions over the decades, then if you look at 100 years ago, people will be holding up the biggest fish and that's won the fishing competition. It'll be enormous. And if you look just a few years ago they would be holding up a tiny fish, but the grins and the sense of triumph are still just exactly the same, because the tiny fish is what the baseline is now, and it's all that people have ever known, and so they think that's what's, you know, the tiny fish is a giant fish.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, yeah, it's just that the opportunities in the natural world for that kind of wonder are so dwindling and diminishing that yeah, the sense of wonder is still, I think, still in everyone. It's just the opportunities to experience it are rarer and rarer.
I think we do still have a sense of wonder for the natural world, but it might just be the context in which we experience that wonder might be changing, you know, because of the lack of actual natural environment. I mean, this idea of, you know, sometime in the next 5 years we'll see on the news baby woolly mammoths. Now, that might sound like the science might sound horrifying, but won't we still kind of want to see them? You know, won't you still experience like a sense of awe at seeing the return of these creatures? We kind of want it. And that's an interesting thought. Like, do deep down we know we've damaged the planet? Do we? Some part of us wants to fix it, and we think, you know, so any kind of positive story in that regard might sort of appeal to us. And the idea, of course, is to there is a huge part of Russia that's been rewilded to called Pleistocene Park, run by this very old, bizarre Russian scientist called Sergei Zimov and his son. They've been buying up these enormous tracts of land and rewilding them to the sort of Pleistocene era environment. And the idea is to release these herds of mammoth so they go back to doing their job and stomping down the snow, making the ground cold and hard again. And they're not going to reverse climate change, but it's this bizarre left field idea, sort of almost desperate idea, that somehow it might help us, you know, solve a problem that we have created. And I do think as humans, we are incredibly stupid, but we're also aware of it. And sometimes, you know, and we make terrible mistakes, all of us, but we're not so bad as to not want to fix the mistakes. And I think there are certainly very clever people around the world who are taking desperate measures now to try and fix the mistakes of the past in order to forge some kind of future for us. And we're not quite sure what that's going to be, but even if it's a new area of wilderness that we're recreating and then reintroducing the animals, it's quite an artificial environment as opposed to the 4% or whatever that's left right now, but it's still something, you know, in the right direction. So I kind of feel a bit more hopeful perhaps than most people, and people have described, I know Mammoth is taught at Melbourne University as an example of writing about the climate in a positive manner, because it's so depressing, right, whenever you hear about this stuff. So it's nice to be able to feel that someone somewhere is trying to do something.
You preempted my next question, because I was going to ask you if, apart from anything else, Mammoth is just a fantastic history lesson. It's really history at its most entertaining. And I was going to ask you if you shared your mammoth's despair and contempt for hominids.
Well, I wrote Mammoth whilst I was working at the RSPCA in Burwood. I was working in the isolation unit for 5 years, just part-time, with sick and injured animals who were in long-term recovery. And that sounds terribly depressing, but it was actually quite a joyous place to work because there were way more positive stories than there were negative ones. I never worked in a place where emotion was bubbling so close to the surface all the time. I mean, I would cry all the time at work, and as would all of my colleagues, because there's always something upsetting that would happen. But there was also so much happiness and happy endings for a lot of the animals. But during that time, I was struggling to, tell this historical tale, and I just thought it's way beyond my ability. I'm not old enough or sort of wise enough to be able to tell this story yet. I almost parked it and almost thought I'll just wait till I'm in my 60s and maybe then I'll be better equipped as a man to be able to tell this story. But then the animals would speak to me every day at work. As any animal owner knows, your dogs, your cats, they communicate to you, and sometimes using smell, sometimes using sound. I used to be able to tell if a cat was sick just by how it smelled. That was the breakthrough for me, where I thought, oh, I should let the animals tell the story. You know, they're going to they have a perspective on us that is perhaps different. Our unofficial motto in the RSPCA was 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, because it was proven to us almost every day. So, and I've never worked in a place with so many people who hated people. so I felt quite at home there.
Nothing there about 1 leg.
No, you've thrown me with that one.
What about birds? Do you not have any birds in there? They've only got 2 legs.
We did have birds. But usually more specialist animals we would send to sanctuaries like Healesville or wherever. People would come in with all sorts of animals, though, that they'd found by the side of the road. It was actually really sweet to see how much time and money that the charity would spend on. And I know not everyone's a fan of the RSPCA, but I quite my opinion of them changed quite deeply whenever I worked there, because I would just see examples of them spending thousands of dollars trying to help an elderly animal, you know, just give it a few more, you know, years of life, rather than just, you know, chuck it in the bin. Yeah.
Lots of people feel a really strong connection to nature, but both of you felt a strong urge to write that down. Harry, where does that come from?
So I've always been interested in nature. My parents, particularly my dad, were very keen bird watchers, and my dad especially very keen camper as well. So, very keen bushwalkers. I mean, so they sort of raised me to be interested in the outdoors. And I grew up in Canberra, which, if you've been there, you'll know is just bush everywhere. So I sort of grew up in that kind of those kind of surroundings. And I used to write fiction, and I imagined that I'd never ever write non-fiction. But even when I wrote fiction, nature and wildlife would always sort of seep in around the margins. And then about a decade ago, in 2011, 2012, I was between jobs and had a lot of time on my hands and need to make myself feel like a bit more useful than I was when I was sitting around trying to find work. So I started writing a blog, which is I'd also sort of just, you know, in my early 30s, and it suddenly dawned on me that my opportunity to be the next David Attenborough had probably passed me by. So I thought, well, you know, I can at least write about the animals that I see around me. So I started writing a blog, which was non-fiction, and it was just about animals that I saw in the urban environment around me in Melbourne. And I found that, I mean, it's a bit pretentious to say it came naturally, but I found it sort of came quite more easily than fiction, and I felt, and the feedback I got from people who read it was that it was better than non-fiction as well. So that was how I started, you know, sort of writing about, you know, animals and the environment in a very concentrated way. And in fact, Chris used to run a sort of storytelling night in St Kilda about a decade ago, and they had an open mic there every month, I think, and I used to go along and read some of those blog pieces at the open mic and got very nice feedback. So Chris is also a big important part of this story. It's always useful for writers who are embarking on a new mode of writing to get positive reinforcement.
Okay, so Chris, where did your urge to write this stuff down rather than just internalize it?
Yeah, I'm a Belfast boy, but we lived in a little country town just outside of Belfast. We moved there because it was the height of the Troubles whenever I was growing up, and moved to a little town called Antrim. And I used to spend a lot of time down by the river, which was called the 6 Mile River, even though it was 36 miles long, because that's Ireland for you. But I've been thinking about this a little bit, especially since coming down here. I live in Phillip Island, and although I'm moving house to Wonthaggi tomorrow, so I've got to get back there tonight. But I was reading Jock's magazine,
Great Ocean Quarterly.
Great Ocean Quarterly. It came in a little goodie bag, and I was having a little look at it and at the beautiful photographs of the ocean and the natural world, and it just reminded me that, you know, I think it's maybe a bit easier when you think about it for us to plug into nature as writers or creatives, because we are nature. You know, we are an integral part of nature, and I think sometimes we forget that. And you know, all the talk about us damaging the environment. We are the environment, you know, and we are really part of it. And living in Australia, we should be more aware of that than a lot of other countries, because the First Peoples here talk about it constantly, about our connection to country. And I did a great event in Phillip Island with Auntie Munya Edwards, and she talked quite openly about how everyone should feel connected to country, and it's okay, you know, even if you came here from another country, or if you were born here recently, you can still feel a connection to the land and to the country. That's okay. In fact, you probably should feel it. And there's a lot of questions she was asked about, you know, is it okay? And she was like, of course it's okay, you know. But I think we distance ourselves a little bit from nature, you know, through living in cities, through the jobs we do, you know, sitting in offices, you know, sitting on computers all day. And we forget that we are part of nature. And I think reminding yourself of that is really integral to being a half-decent person. And I constantly think about that now when I'm writing, so it doesn't seem so unusual for me to be writing about the natural world, because I feel very connected to it.
As writers, you also have to be readers. So what were you reading growing up, Harry?
Anything I could get my hands on, really. More recently, I mean, I was one of those readers when I was a kid who just lie on the sofa all through the summer holidays in school and just read book after book after book. They all just grazed the surface. None of them sunk in deeply because I was reading too much too quickly, but that's sort of how you are when you were a kid. I was actually thinking about this just a few weeks ago, or sort of remembering, because, you know, people, you know, we always ask these days, you know, the older people, you know, I'm just old enough to have been a kid in the pre-internet time, so we always sort of ask this question of what did you do before the internet, and I sort of had this memory a couple of weeks ago of how I used to lie on the floor of my bedroom with my parents' one-volume encyclopedia, the Hutchinson Encyclopedia, which is an amazing one-volume encyclopedia, and you know how in the entries in encyclopedia they'll have a little paragraph of text, and then there'll be next to a word where they'll have like a little arrow indicating that there's an entry elsewhere in the encyclopedia for that word. So I just follow those arrows back and forth in the encyclopedia, just flicking back and forth and back and forth.
People do that with Wikipedia. There's a game.
Yeah, well, I still do it with Wikipedia too.
Yeah. Yeah. Chris?
Well, this might shock a few people, but my parents were illiterate. Functionally so, but my father left school when he was 6, I think. He never actually attended school very much at all. He couldn't read or write. My mother left school when she was 10. She could read, but as a kid I was the only person in our house that had any sort of education, and so I would do all the reading and writing in the household. One of my first gigs as a kid was, as a writer, was my father recruiting me to write letters of complaint to power tool companies, so that he could then, he was running a little scam where he would pick something up from the car boot sale, it'd be broken. I would write to Black & Decker saying, this is a disgrace, you know, we're long-time customers of Black & Decker, and then they would tell him to get it fixed. He would get it fixed through his friend. They would send a huge invoice, you know. Anyway, there was a whole scam going on. But we only had 3 books in the house. They were the Bible, of course. That was the first book I ever read. The Winnie the Pooh, or the House of Pooh Corner, yeah, and William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist. There's your 3 classic Irish family books. Yeah. So I read The Exorcist when I was way too young and was very confused about what was going on with that crucifix. So libraries were vastly important to me. The local library was huge for me as a kid. The librarians very quickly cottoned on that I was a precocious reader and would direct me towards certain books, and I would spend all my time after school in the library pouring through encyclopedias and books on geography and history, and they pushed me towards science fiction quite early, and that was kind of great because it really expanded my imagination as a child. and that has probably, there's definitely a legacy of that for me now. I'm kind of writing science fiction light, I suppose.
I would now like to indulge in what I hope is the greatest non sequitur ever uttered in this room. Chris, you used to be a runway model for Hugo Boss in Europe.
Can't you tell? Would you like me to demonstrate the walk? Yeah, there's a specific walk I was taught. So you basically put one foot in front of the other like that as you're walking. So.
There's a ledge there.
Yes, I had many different jobs having left home.
But that must have been amazing at that high pitch for Hugo Boss.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like? Stressful?
No, it was amazing because I was recruited in the street. I was obviously, much more handsome then. I know that's hard to believe, Harry. But,
we're going to ask Harry about his runway career in a moment.
But I was just recruited.
You're still handsome to me, Chris.
Oh, thank you. I was recruited in the street. I didn't really believe it, and then we had to, go to these runway shows, and I'd be sharing a dressing room with 9 female models who were either naked or in lingerie, and it was a pretty hard gig, but I stuck with it and walked them up and down the catwalk. The whole time I had a big smile on my face when you're not really supposed to be smiling. You're meant to be really serious and moody. Yeah. But
Did you know then that Hugo Boss was the preferred designer for the SS?
Yes, I found that out later. Yes, I actually have a Hugo Boss jacket with me today. But yes.
Anyway, further down, you come up with Mammoth.
Yes.
But Mammoth has led to kind of a unusual sidebar to your public life.
Yes. So typical writer, you end up doing lots of different jobs in your life, so I got an email out of the blue just over a year ago from head of exhibitions at Museums Victoria saying, can you come in for a meeting? And it was in between lockdowns. Okay. And I just thought, they didn't really explain what it was about. I didn't even know how they got my email. So I went in for a meeting, and they asked me to bring some pretty books to show them things I might have worked on over the years. And in this room full of all these important people who are all smiling at me and nodding like, oh, here he is. And as it turned out, they had bought a Triceratops, Melbourne Museum, the most complete Triceratops ever discovered by humanity. It was discovered in 2017 in the wilderness of Montana by a guy called Craig. At the time, the Victorian government were looking to acquire something large for the museum, something impressive, a dinosaur. And they quickly sent the head paleontologist, Eric Fitzgerald, out there to examine the specimen, and we bought it before it ever got onto the open market, $3 million. It probably would have gone for 4 times that on the open market. And they'd all read Mammoth. And I was shocked, but then I thought, of course they have, because they're the only ones who would have probably read it. Paleontologists, people working in museums. And so they wanted to hire me to create a voice and personality for the Triceratops specimen, which at that time was still in Vancouver Island off the coast of Canada being cleaned and was shipped to Melbourne during the pandemic. I worked so hard during the pandemic. We had an exemption to go to the museum to get the specimen unpacked and reassembled. It was described as the most bizarre piece of IKEA furniture ever. And now I'm the editor-in-residence at Museums Victoria. I have a desk looking out over the exhibition building and complete imposter syndrome waiting to be found out as to why I'm there. And my remit is to bring the museum collection to life through books for the coming years. And they're just sitting down there. There's 2 books sitting at the front there. There's one called Horridus Journey of a Triceratops, which is the big coffee table book that I edited. Interviewed paleontologists, welders, all sorts of people from all walks of life who had worked with the specimen, and it's got all the photographs showing the complete journey. It's the most photographed dinosaur in history. And also the kids' book, I wrote Horridus and the Hidden Valley, which is the first in a series of kids' books about Horridus, the Triceratops, back in the Cretaceous era. And the second one of those comes out next month. And I've got another kids' book coming out about a time-traveling echidna, because of the new exhibition that's about to open at the museum in December called Gondwana Garden, which is the prehistory of Victoria. So bizarre. I suddenly find myself as at the museum, surrounded by people with 16 PhDs, wondering how I wound up there.
Sure, but no one can walk like you, Chris.
No, that's it.
Harry, one final question, because our time's up, unbelievably. But you're a bird nerd. You do not call yourself a twitcher. I don't think you even like that term particularly, and you don't feel it applies to you. But you were out this morning doing a bit of bird watching in the rain. What did you see?
So firstly, briefly, for people who don't know, twitcher, at least within bird watching community, twitcher is a very specific type of bird watcher. They're the ones who, if some brown little thing that's never been seen in Australia before suddenly blows up on the coast of Western Australia, twitchers are the ones who drop everything and travel over there to see it. It's very, very hardcore, it sounds very tiring and expensive, to be honest. There's a certain threshold that I don't wish to cross, into which I become a twitcher. But I'm not above going for a wander in the morning down to the beach in Port Fairy.
So what did you see this morning?
So I saw 3 hooded plovers and a bunch of albatrosses, probably black-browed albatrosses, which is very nice. And then in the wetlands on the way back, 1 Latham snipe as well. So Latham snipe is, you'll be familiar with, unfortunately, with the much lamented former Labor Party leader, now One Nation member, who goes on rants on Twitter and stuff. So it's not that kind of Latham snipe.
No, unfortunately,
Latham snipe is a lovely migratory shorebird which breeds in Japan and flies down and spends 6 months over the summer in wetlands in Australia, mostly hiding in the reeds.
Yeah, they're hard to see.
Yeah, it flew in and landed, and then by the time I got my spotting scope out, it had disappeared. So
do you have a preferred bird guide? What is your preferred bird guide?
I've got a couple. So for nostalgic purposes, I really, really love The Simpson and Day. It's the one I grew up using. I think the illustrations are really lovely. So illustrations in bird field guides often look like mugshots. There's sort of, there's a bird in profile, and it's like, what's this bird done? Is it in jail now? Simpson and Day, the illustrations are really beautiful. They're actually real proper works of art and very naturalistic. And for me, they give a terrific sense of how the bird holds itself. Sort of, how it, rather than just sort of something like that, it'll be, how it sort of twists around to feed on a eucalypt blossom or things like that. So it gives you a sense of what the bird might look like in its natural behaviour. So I really like Simpson and Day. But there's also a few years ago, through CSRO, the Australian Bird Guide came out, which is a massive thing, and it's the most comprehensive, most detailed field guide for birds that's ever been published in Australia, and it's incredible work. It is a bit mugshotty, but other than that, it's amazing. It's also an absolute brick.
They've just published a
So just a month ago, the condensed version of that, the compact Australian Bird Guide, was published, which is much, much smaller, still just as informative. So that's probably going to be my go-to field guide for here on.
So not Pizian Night?
No, I never used Pizian Night. So my parents had Slater. Some of you may remember the Slater field guide. It used to be in 2 volumes of passerines and non-passerines, and all the non-passerines were in black and white. And so that's the one I grew up with. And then the illustrations were not that great, so then when I was a kid I bought Simpson and Day.
Do we have any questions? Anything at all? Yes.
I'd like you to talk about your siblings, if you have any, as when you were kids growing up, and did they support you, and do they support you in your present job?
We would like to talk about how dysfunctional your families were. That's essentially the question.
I've got a brother who's 4.5 years older than me, and He's a pastry chef in Canberra. He makes, if you're ever in Canberra, go to the farmers markets and load up on macarons and pastries from Dream Cuisine. They're amazing. He really knows his stuff. He'll come bushwalking sometimes. We'll go camping, with my dad when we were kids. But he's not really as much into nature as I am. But yeah, he's supportive. As my parents are. It's just parallel lives, really.
Yeah. I have a sister who's 4 years younger than me, and she doesn't hate my guts, but we've never really got along very well, and my family always treated me like I was an aberration, something to be ashamed of as a creative person, and had no interest whatsoever in any of whether I was doing catwalk modeling or traveling the world or writing books. They've never read any of my books. They're just not interested. The last time I went home, on the sideboard, there was a photograph of my sister on my parents' house, and then there was a photograph of the dog, and then one of the cat. And the dog and the cat are both dead. None of me, the only son and eldest, But that's fine, that's fine. I've made my peace with it. I sort of stopped trying to convince them of my worth a long time ago, and went out on my own, and I'm happy to pat myself on the back occasionally, and that's what I've learned. That's how I've learned to live without the support of any family, really. And
I think you've got an awful lot of fans, Chris. Yeah.
Well, it's funny how the family you're born into sometimes don't wind up being the family that you have as you get older. You find your family sometimes, and friends, and
well, that's the great thing about friends. You actually choose them.
That's right. So I do have supportive friends. It is a strange life being a writer, I think, and a lot of people do sort of screw their face up a little bit when you tell them, and they're like, "What is it? Like, what do you do? Like, how does it work? How do you live?"
Either that, or they think it's much more exciting than it actually is.
Yeah. They think of J.K. Rowling, and then you have $700 million in your bank account. Whereas the reality is quite different.
Yeah, you've got $700. Anyone else? Next question. I have a question.
Oh.
Do either of you have any sentimental attachment to Brumbies in the high country?
Possibly when I was a kid. So I grew up in Canberra, and I used to go with my dad to watch the local rugby team, which is called the ACT Brumbies. I think the issue of Brumbies and horses, particularly in the high country, which is such a fragile ecosystem, it really encapsulates in microcosm all the issue we have with valuing the cultural legacy of European colonisation and nothing that came before. I mean that is a sort of general broad overview of Australian sort of mainstream society. People celebrate the cultural importance, or supposed cultural importance of horses, especially in the high country, and there's sort of cultural legacy. Meanwhile, ignoring the cultural legacy and cultural value that is tens of thousands of years old, of all the ecosystems and animals that these recent blow-ins of horses are trampling over roughshod.
So that's a hard no from you, Chris?
I've seen them. A few years ago, because I'm in the motorbike club on Phillip Island, and we go on trips all around Victoria, and we went to Jindabyne and went through the mountains, and I pulled over because I was like, bloody hell, there's horses over there, and I didn't want them running across the road, so I stopped to watch them for a while. And there's this what do they call a group of Brumbies? Is it a band of Brumbies? Is it?
I don't know, an arsehole
of Brumbies. A band of Brumbies, whatever it was, and just to watch them run across the landscape was a sort of a majestic thing to see, but the landscape itself was quite blighted.
Yeah.
So I think that's the dichotomy of of the natural world and what we're doing, and and I'm talking about reintroducing species, but it's going to go wrong, isn't it? We're not smart enough to do it right.
But I think also the trap that we often fall into in Australia with regards to feral animals and introduced animals is that we think that when we acknowledge the damage and the harm they do and how we basically need them to not be there, we think that means also we have to then also hate the animal. And horses are, they're spectacular, they're beautiful animals, they're magnificent to see, but that doesn't mean that they belong there. And this is kind of the mess that we've made for ourselves. We have to sort of think our way around that. I saw recently, I saw a few years ago with a friend of mine when we were out bird watching. We saw some fox cubs, baby foxes, and my friend who's a photographer took photos and he posted the photos on Twitter. And my friend and I both agreed these like some of the most adorable, cutest animals we've ever seen. And my friend got in so much trouble for sort of people who followed him for just acknowledging that these animals, which no one is denying, are absolutely terrible pests. They're incredibly destructive. And yet somehow that means we're not allowed to say they're also charismatic and beautiful animals. Like, just because we're saying that something is beautiful and charismatic, that doesn't mean that we want it to be there.
One final question in the end, and it's a yes or no answer. The Tasmanian devil has not been absent from Victoria for that long. Bring it back, yes or no?
Not yet.
Chris?
They are horrifying creatures. You can go to Tasmania and watch them being fed. My partner went recently, and she said it was just a horror show. So I'm going to say hard no on the Tasmanian.
I would say that in Victoria, much more urgently, we need to change our attitude about dingoes and let dingoes be more prevalent in Victoria as they once were.
Okay, thank you very much. Could you please thank Harry Sadler and Chris Flynn?
Thank you.
And as always, thank you so much, Joe and Dean, for this miracle of a festival. It's been absolutely wonderful.